Awesome. Um, as Jen mentioned, I want to talk to you all about skinny labels, all this jazz about drug patents and what it means for access for our patients. And as Jen alluded to, the reason that this is sort of a timely issue is that there is a court case, Amarin v. Hikma, that is going to be coming forth to the Supreme Court. Actually, I believe hearings start next week on April 29th. And so this is something that we will probably be hearing a lot about over the next few weeks and months. Um, so here's kind of my goals for tonight is just kind of walk you through the basics of the case itself, who the players are, what's going to be talked about at the Supreme Court, give you a little sense of what the implications are for patients, healthcare system, and generic drugs. And then kind of talk about how this is just one little part of the whole issue of drug patents, go into things like evergreening, and then talk about what pieces of legislation are there right now floating around in Congress. And would love to, by the end of this, open it up for discussion with everyone to talk about what actions we could maybe take here at the FDA task force and DFA at large. My goal is, because this is a wonky topic, is to hopefully make you not fall asleep by the end of this presentation. And if there's any questions, please interrupt. So what is the case Hikma v. Amarin all about? So it centers around this drug called Vascepa. And would be curious to know if anyone has actually prescribed this drug, but it's basically just a prescription grade, highly concentrated fish oil drug that is produced by Amarin. It is in fact the only drug that Amarin has in its portfolio, so it's kind of its golden goose. Vascepa was first approved in 2012 to treat dangerously high triglyceride levels, so pretty much people with familial hypertriglyceridemia, which, as you know, puts you at risk for cardiovascular disease. It is marketed for about $4,000 a year, so it's quite expensive. In 2019, Amarin got a second approval, so a second patent for a new use. And this was for reducing heart attacks and strokes in high-risk patients, so sort of your more common case of high triglycerides. Amarin had spent about $300 million in this trial to get the second patent. By 2020, 90% of Vascepa's sales were for this second indication, because this is where the vast majority of patients qualified for the drug. In comes Hikma, which is a generic manufacturer. They're based in the UK. In 2016, they applied to make a generic version, but only for the first off-patent use. So this was for the initial patent that Amarin applied for the familial hypertriglyceridemia. The cardiac use, the cardiac prevention use, the second patent was still protected. And so that was left off of the label that Hikma applied for. So the FDA approved this, and this is called a skinny label, which we'll talk a little bit about more, which made the medication generic in 2020. So what Amarin alleges after that is that Hikma has been infringing on their patents, basically saying that Hikma put out a press release calling its product the generic version of Vascepa. They cited in that press release that nearly $1 billion, or that Vascepa makes $1 million in total sales, without mentioning that those sales reflected really the second patent use, the cardiac prevention use, that Hikma's label did not cover. So Amarin said this was misleading. This was going to lead doctors like us to prescribe the generic version for patented indications. And so they sued Hikma for infringement. Notably, there are 11 companies with generic versions of Vascepa for the first indication, the familial hypertriglyceridemia. But Amarin says that it is only Hikma that has infringed on their patents because they're the ones who have published these misleading statements that are going to make healthcare providers like us interpret them as encouraging prescriptions that infringe on the patents. So I think like I said, this is kind of a wonky topic, and there's a lot of legal concepts that are at play. And so the slide is kind of designed to try to break those down. So the first that I want to cover is the Hatch-Waxman Act, which we've talked about in previous committee meetings before. So this was sort of landmark legislation that was passed by Congress in 1984 to basically solve a specific problem, that brand name drugs were using patents to keep generics off the market indefinitely. So Hatch-Waxman created a streamlined pathway for generics to prove their drugs work without repeating expensive clinical trials. And it's the reason that 90% of prescriptions today in the US that are filled are generics. Skinny label. So this is one of the tools that's been created by Hatch-Waxman. So when a drug has multiple uses and only some are still patented, a generic, like in this case Hikma, can get approval for the patents that have now expired. So this is called a skinny label on the bottle. So it's intentionally leaving out the patented indications. Congress designed this so that a patent on one use doesn't block competition for other uses. Then there's the term induced infringement, which is what Amarin is alleging in this lawsuit. So under patent law, you don't have to do the infringing yourself. You can be liable if you encourage someone else to do it. So in this case, Amarin's argument is that Hikma's marketing is encouraging doctors to prescribe the generic medication for a patented indication, because it's more affordable and accessible. And then the last thing I want to mention is a previous court case, which was GlaxoSmithKline, the large pharmaceutical company, versus Teva, which was another generic manufacturer. This was the last time that an issue of skinny labels came before the courts, and it made it as far to a federal circuit court that actually sided in this case with GlaxoSmithKline. So in this case, the drug was carvedilol, a common beta blocker. Its patented indication for hypertension had expired, but GlaxoSmithKline still had patented on use for congestive heart failure. And so very similarly, GSK claimed that Teva was marketing carvedilol for, in a way that would promote doctors to prescribe the generic version for congestive heart failure. In this case, the federal court actually sided with the brand name company, and it had been appealed to go up to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court did not take it up. So essentially, for some reason, the Supreme Court is taking it up this time, and it's kind of answering a similar question, but it's the first time it's come before the Supreme Court. So essentially, the Supreme Court this go around has agreed to take up two questions, and in my mind, they both really boil down to the same fundamental issue, which is how much does a skinny label actually protect a generic manufacturer? So the first question is sort of, is calling your drug the generic version of a brand name drug and quoting the brand's total sales figures enough to accuse you of induced infringement, even if the label correctly leaves out patented uses? Hikma says no, Amarin says yes. And then question two is even broader, which is, can a company be sued for induced infringement if nothing you ever said actually mentioned the patented use? And this is a question that people are saying can have implications well beyond pharma. But I think to put it all plainly and to summarize it, Hikma is saying that they have done exactly what Congress said it could do under Hatch-Waxman, and Amarin is saying that Hikma's marketing of the drug has crossed a line. And so the Supreme Court kind of has to decide where that line exists. I think it's also important one crucial fact here is that the Solicitor General, which is kind of like the top lawyer for the administration, the federal administration, has filed a brief in this case, and they are actually supporting the generic manufacturer Hikma. So they have argued that Amarin's sort of lawsuit subverts Congress's balance that it's tried to create and threatens to make the skinny label pathway too risky to use. And so I think that's kind of a significant signal in this court case that this federal administration has actually weighed in and has clearly kind of aligned itself with the generic manufacturer. So now kind of just to talk about the stakes. whether the court sides with Amarin or Hikma, I think real patients and healthcare costs hang in the balance. And at its core, the implications of the case is who's going to get affordable medications and when. So if Amaro wins, the implications go beyond just this one drug. The immediate effect is that any claim to call a product a generic version of a brand name drug, which is something that generics routinely do, not only in communication with physicians, but also with patients, is going to become a pretty strong legal liability for them. And I think people are worried that it's going to dissuade generic manufacturers from entering the market because that risk is going to be much higher in terms of are they going to be sued by brand name companies. And so it's essentially a deterrent for generics to enter the market. For patients, I think you all probably are grasping here that this is going to lead to higher prices and delayed access for our patients. For this drug in particular, as I mentioned, Vascepa costs roughly $4,000 a year, and the generic is fractions of that. It's in the hundreds of dollars. And so really every month of delayed generic entry is going to have significant cost to patients in the healthcare system. There is some sort of counter arguments that people are making here, which is that Amarin did invest $300 million in an additional clinical trial to get its secondary patents for secondary uses. And it's argued that, that trial is saving lives. It's preventing heart attacks and strokes for patients who need it. And so there is some concern that protection of skinny label kind of reduces the value of some of these secondary patents for brand name companies. On the other hand, if Hikma wins this lawsuit, the skinny label system that we have right now kind of just gets reaffirmed, that generics can properly carve out patented uses and avoid directly promoting those uses as litigation. That's generally good news, but it's kind of just protecting the status quo. Generics, the fact that now we have 80 to 90% of generics in our market, estimates are that it saves Medicare about $1.5 billion, like in the last 5 years alone. So the most recent evidence is between 2015 and 2020. And so that's significant savings. And then, like I said, 7 other manufacturers right now already sell this generic version of Vascepa. And so it shows you that this is a medication where there's actually competition in the generic market. And so a win for the generics here is going to protect that competitive market and continue to hopefully drive prices down. I think the other key takeaway is that I want you to take away from this is that a win for Hikma here does not fix the broader system of the way patents are used to slow down entry of generics. It's only going to kind of keep the status quo that we have now. It does nothing to address patent thickets, product hopping, orange book gaming, pay for delay, all of those tactics, which I will talk about in a coming slide. Cool. Let me stop there. I guess before I go on, is there any questions? I know that is lots of legal jargon and very wonky.
Hi, I have one question. This is Aitisha.
Sure.
So just to confirm, if a drug company is making a drug and they have multiple patents, once the patent expires, it gives like for whatever indication they have. So let's say they have like different patents for different indications. Once it is expired, a generic company can swoon in and patent whatever indication that was expired by the bigger pharmaceutical company. And that's legal to do.
Yes. And so when a generic, so typically, a drug is produced, it's FDA approved, it gets patented. Generally, a drug manufacturer gets 20 years of protection. And then they can apply for additional patents for new uses. Those are called like method of use patents. So you can have a patent for prevention of heart attack. You could have a patent for maybe prevention of stroke and a patent for reducing cholesterol. I'm just kind of giving examples. And then let's say that first patent expires, the 20 years is up. You're right. A generic manufacturer can now come in and manufacture that drug and bring it to the market. So the generic manufacturers are not necessarily now asking for a patent, right? Because that has already been patented and owned by the brand name. But once a patent expires, it allows whoever wants to come onto the market to do so for that specific indication. And so the idea is now we have sort of a free market system for that drug for that indication.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah,
So first of all, just want to congratulate you for a very clear and superb presentation. Terrific. Um, am I to infer from what you said that the case revolves around the idea that Hikma advertised it as a generic for the patented drug rather than just made it and had a skinny label? If they had stuck with the skinny label alone, there wouldn't be a case. Is that correct?
I think so. I think what Amarin is alleging is that, yes, the way that Hikma has advertised this drug has infringed on their patents. The fact that they sort of called their generic version the generic of Vascepa, and the fact that in their press releases they cited that Vascepa brings in X billion dollars of revenue, um, that was kind of too blanket of a statement. It did not delineate that their drug was only for the smaller first indication of extremely high genetic reasons for having elevated triglycerides and didn't distinguish that from the more commonly used version and the secondary indications of cardiac disease prevention.
I have another question, which is uh, my perspective on the Supreme Court is it often will do narrow decisions based on procedural technicalities rather than dealing with um, uh, possible outcomes from their decision. So they might not pay any attention to the clinical issues you raised, but just make an administrative rule red line.
I think you're right. Like, I don't know if the implications on patient access and cost is necessarily going to be front and center in the justice's mind. And I'm sure there might be some lawyers out there who might tell me it shouldn't be. So, but you're right. I think that's where we come in as physicians and as an organization, is to try to raise the alarm bell on that, whatever implications of the court's ruling is.
I have a question. Excellent presentation. The part that always puzzles me in terms of this whole thing is that physicians generally are protected against off-label prescribing of medications.
Mm-hmm.
and so that defeats whatever the original concept is, because and I'll be frank about it, I've had drug salespeople come up and say, well, you can use it for such and such and such, even though it is not patent for that. It is an off-label use. So the whole issue of off-label has become a very murky issue. This full disclosure, we had a big grant from NIH to basically try to look at agents that had already patented, but what other uses could be used for these agents. And I was amazed at a number of different other uses for many of these agents, but were not being investigated. Nothing was being done with it because the companies didn't see any benefit to being able to pursue these other avenues. And the only thing that was good was if some very bright patent on the other not patenting group would weep in, find out, and then pursue it in yet another whole different mechanism.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. Like off-label prescribing is something that's so common. I mean, part of my trainings in pediatrics, we're often using like adult medications off-label. So I think that is not necessarily something that I'm getting it's like I'm worried is going to be impacted, but I think it's the fact that are we even going to have generics enter the market based on how the court rules? Like what is the risk landscape for generic manufacturers? How does that change based on the court's interpretation? And I think, and I can go on now to the next part of this presentation, is that I think in addition to this skinny label topic, I think the fact that this is coming up in front of the Supreme Court gives us an opportunity to sort of bring back the topic of patent abuse in pharmaceuticals and other ways and other parts of this that we need to address as a country and as a system. Um, I'm sure everyone here is probably familiar with the term patent evergreening or has probably heard about it briefly. But the idea of patent evergreening is sort of using the patent system in sort of an advantageous way to try to, in a strategic way, to delay competition and delay generics from being able to enter the market. So sort of the like average number of patents that are filed on some of our like most used and medications is in the hundreds. And more than half of patents on medications are filed after a drug is FDA approved. So that tells you that even after a company gets FDA approval and is now entering the market, they are still working on trying to figure out how they can apply for more patents to just extend that exclusivity that they have. Probably one of the most like notorious examples of this is AbbVie's drug Humira. Um, this is an example of a drug and a company that has over 130 patents on its medication, which has given it an extra 20 years of exclusivity. So that's on top of the initial 20 years that an initial patent would have given them. And some consumer groups estimate that the cost of all of these secondary patents to consumers is to the tune of over $50 billion, which is a pretty wild number to think about. So again, a few additional terms. So one is patent thickets. This is one tactic that companies use, which is basically just overlapping patents and creating kind of this strict wall of patents that give them protection. The second is product hopping. This is when they switch patients to new formulations to kind of reset the clock. So like I commonly think of like your extended release medications. It's not uncommon that it's not until the end of a patent expiration that a company comes out with a new extended release version of that med, and they get new patents for it. Third is this idea of orange book gaming, which is basically just like patenting here and there, left and right, and some of these patents are questionable, but it's like to create this like complexity and this mess, and it makes it very easy for them to file lawsuits of infringement. And the FTC at times has tried to challenge this behavior, but it kind of depends who's running the FTC. And then the last is this pay for delay, which is basically brand name companies paying generic manufacturers to hold off on entering the market. And this has been estimated to cost $3.5 billion a year to patients. I think I see a hand up. Elad, do you have a question?
Yeah, yeah. So I just wanted to clarify. So there may be new patents for these agents, but of course, if the drug is by that point generic, the generic companies obviously can sell and people can use them, whichever way they'd like. So I mean, it's not against anything you just said, but I just wanted to clarify that while this patent thicket or whatever you want to call it might exist, there are alternative pathways for other companies to essentially sell drugs, and I guess technically this would be off-label use, is what you would say?
Yeah, so I think part of it, sometimes the strategy is that, as a patent is nearing the end of its term of, let's say 20 years, they might be able to patent a new formulation or a new component of the drug that tries to extend that exclusivity. And then I think the other thing is that by having all these many patents, it just makes it more complicated for generic manufacturers to come into the market because they have to make sure they're not doing so in a way that infringes on any of those new patents. And I think, skinny labels is one aspect of that.
Right. But but in a technical sense, while they might not be able to market directly, if they don't have that, they can certainly sell and people can use things any way they'd like.
Yeah, I think if a generic is there and whether there's litigation pending or there isn't, it's not being challenged, then yes. Yeah.
Thanks.
And Atisha, I think, do you have a question?
Yes, I just say not a question, but your Mac-free Safe Connect, I can see like the thing just came up. So it blocks what you have on your screen on my end, the VPN.
Can everyone else see my?
Oh, yeah, I got that too.
Yeah, there's just a little box in the bottom right hand.
Yes,
That's the kind
that's
of block
all.
the page.
Oh,
Just that pop-up.
Thank
is
you.
it gone now?
It's gone. Thank you. That's
Okay,
all.
sorry. Thanks. That's my computer telling me I need to be more secure, probably. William, do you have a question?
Yeah, I think part of some of the need for rules came up with the one of the companies, well, the medication of bupropion. But each time that the patent was getting ready to expire, they went out and came out with a new formulation. First, they had the bupropion regular, then bupropion extended release, then the extra extended release, then the SR. All of the same medication, slightly different times in which it was active, but they got real extensive patent protection for a while. And unfortunately, there has really been no other agents that's been developed that has a similar profile.
Yeah, I think bupropion is one that comes to mind. Metformin extended release is another common one that is still, metformin extended release is still much more pricey than just the generic metformin. Yeah. So the next few slides, I kind of just wanted to go over some of the legislation. I'll try to be very brief with each of these, and then I think by the end of it, would love to have a discussion about what maybe if there's any opportunity for us as a group to get behind any of these. So the first one is Senate Bill 2276, which is called the Ethic Act. Stands for Eliminating Thickets to Increase Competition. This was introduced in July of 2025. It's a bipartisan bill introduced by Senators Welch, Hawley, and Klobuchar. And I think bipartisan is kind of an understatement when you talk about Welch and Hawley agreeing on something. But this bill sort of takes direct aim at patent thickets by limiting brand manufacturers to asserting sort of only one patent per patent group in a single infringement lawsuit. In practical terms, what that basically means is that if you have 40 patents that all trace back to the same core invention, then this legislation is suggesting that a company can only bring one of them to court at a time. And what that would basically do is reduce the leverage that brand manufacturers have to bury generic competitors in litigation. And this bill also has a House component that was also introduced in May of 2025. It's important to know that the Ethic Act is something that DFA has publicly come out in support for, and a bunch of, in collaboration with many other organizations. So this is the statement that Public Citizen released, I think just 8 or 9 days ago, that shows DFA as a signatory. Another piece of legislation is called the Remedy Act, stands for Reforming, Evergreening, and Manipulation that Extends Drug Years. This one was also introduced in July of 2025. This piece of legislation would amend sort of FDA's way of generic drug approval and target the way brand manufacturers abuse the process of delaying generic entry through those sort of extended release formulations and other trivial patents. It basically would limit the ability of brand name companies to file excessive patents and prevent these like 30-month delays that happen at the FDA when a company files a new patent. So basically, when they file for a new patent, it gives them kind of like immediate 30-month exclusivity that kind of limits generic competitors from even considering entering the market. So I think of it as kind of like cleaning up the front door of the generic pipeline and making it harder for the brand companies to use the FDA's approval process as a delay mechanism. There's also a couple of sort of bills that were introduced together back in March of 2025. Both of these bills have already gone before the Senate Judiciary Committee and have been cleared. The first one, so Senate Bill 1040, targets product hopping. So the idea here is that a brand company, knowing its patent is about to expire, will release a new version of the drug. Like I said, the extended release, a different coating, a slightly different dose, and this shifts patients to the new version before a generic of the original can even launch. And this bill would let the Federal Trade Commission treat this practice actually as an antitrust violation. And then its counterpart bill 1041 is doing something similar, but specifically for biologics and trying to prevent patent thickets for biologics. This, of all the bills, is actually one that was voted on in the Senate in July of 2024 and actually passed the Senate unanimously. I believe it just was not picked up by the House. And so just say that's kind of a rare thing for, it to pass the Senate unanimously. It has been reintroduced this Congress, and it did have a CBO scoring back in 2024, and it was estimated to save taxpayers $1.8 billion over 10 years. And both of these bills are co-signed by a couple Republicans, so Cornyn and Grassley, and then a couple of Democrats, Durbin and Blumenthal. And then the very last pair of legislation I want to talk about are 1096 and 1097. These were also introduced in about April of 2025. The first one, 1096, bans the pay for delay tactic. So brand name companies basically paying off generics to not enter the market. The FTC has done calculations and estimates that this would save consumers about $3.5 billion per year. And then 1097 is probably the least flashy of all of these bills, but one could argue is the most foundational. It would create sort of a task force between the FDA and the US Patent Office to coordinate patent listing. So right now, these two agencies are both kind of working in silo. So the FDA lists a patent a brand company certifies as relevant to its drug, and there's sort of very little scrutiny. And then that 30-month exclusivity period already kind of kicks in. And so this would kind of let those two agencies work together to try to tackle that. There's additional legislation, and I can share this PowerPoint after. I'm not going to go into the weeds of all of this because I've already done that. But kind of, this is a slide I kind of created to conceptualize it for myself about like how do all of these pieces of legislation fit together. And so really the way I think about it is like we got to kind of prevent these bad patent practices. We got to have better litigation to go after these companies when they engage in these behaviors, and we kind of need better enforcement as well. And so that's kind of how I've categorized this legislation. And we can talk more about this in the discussion. And then this is kind of just comparing all those 6 pieces of legislation I talked about, sort of what's their name, what part of this system they're targeting, where they're at. So several of these have already gone, they're on the Senate legislative calendar for a vote at some point. And then the Remedy and Ethics Acts are still in committee, in the Help Committee and the Judiciary Committee, respectively. So kind of next steps for us, this is where I was hoping we could answer a few more questions and maybe have a discussion of like, what should our role be here? My initial thoughts are that first, the skinny label court case is coming up in a week, and I think we expect a decision sometime in June or July. And so probably as an organization, we should be prepared to respond to whatever decision is going to come forth. I think right now it seems likely that the court is going to rule in favor of the generics, just given sort of the Solicitor General's input and what I've been reading from other sort of lawyers who are more expert at this, but you never know. We probably should be prepared to respond either way. The second is, I think, again, this is an opportunity. This is, patents are going to be again in the news and in front of the court. And while skinny label is only one issue, it gives us an opportunity to talk about all the other ways we need to see patent reform to benefit our patients. And so I think that's an opportunity for us to communicate what implications there are for our patients and our health system. Third is, I think we all probably can think of patient stories. There's impact on special populations, kind of alluded to, like skinny label has a pretty significant impact on the pediatric population and might impact the ability for generics to be prescribed off-label. And then lastly is DFA has already put its support behind one piece of legislation. Do we want to do so for others? And kind of what advocacy do we want to do potentially on the Hill at another fly-in or something like that to really talk more about patents and drug pricing. So I'll leave it at that. And hopefully we can talk about other ideas for us as a group.
Anmol, thank you. That was just a terrific presentation. I think you took an extraordinarily complex issue and made it very understandable. So thank you for the effort that you put into this. It's just extraordinary. And this is one of those rare intersections with the FDA where accessibility, because of cost, actually is a core FDA responsibility. And so it's a great topic for us to think about and develop a strategy and to make that a part of our advocacy platform. We could have a small working group that keeps us abreast of the news and the challenges in this area going forward and develop essentially a portfolio of information that we can use when we're on the Hill. And this is the perfect year to do it since affordability is such an issue. And we know that the attempts on the outside of these issues by negotiating with pharmaceutical companies to lower costs really aren't having the payoff for our patients and aren't really improving access. So I'd love to hear the sentiment of the group and whether there's a consensus that this is something that we want to carry forward as a working group again and to develop a platform, essentially a policy brief, an issue brief that we can share up on the Hill.
Can I ask a question? This is my first meeting, and I'm really sorry I'm so far behind you guys. But one of the issues that kept going through my mind is the political environment. God help me, I hate the political environment, but we're stuck with the political environment. There seems to be a sentiment to lower drug prices and a push to lower drug prices. But at the same time, the pharmaceutical lobbies are extraordinarily powerful. How do you approach something like this? I mean, to me, the facts are pretty clear and there needs to be reform. But, and of course, the Supreme Court will weigh in and probably come out with a solution that is not favorable in our opinion. But how do you approach the situation? I mean, who do you go to? What do you do? I'm sorry to be so ignorant.
Sort of the process that we use, Donald, is to, first of all, decide how meaningful that is to us, gather the facts, bring the stories. And what we have found is that when we start reaching out to members of Congress, they connect us with other members and other people that can help us. And it's building that network and building that momentum. But it is true the pharmaceutical companies are spending a lot of money lobbying, but generic manufacturers are as well. And there's also a recognition too that, there's a finite amount of money for healthcare. And as things tighten, it becomes even more imperative, and it allows us to work on people who are on the fence about this. Maybe they haven't taken a stand about it. Maybe it hasn't been their passion. Maybe they don't understand the impacts on their constituents. And we convince those people.
So the if I again, I don't want to take up too much time, but um so you would back the generics, or because they seem like they would potentially have some issues as well.
Well, we're not going to back any industry, but it's a complex playing field, I guess is
Right.
what I'm saying, that the generics are in there. There are also public interest groups in there. What makes us unique is that we aren't attached to any big money donors.
Yeah.
And that does give us some credibility. And, it is surprising how often we can find openness on the Hill with something that makes a lot of sense and provides benefit for both the legislator and their constituents
From both sides of the aisle.
on both sides of the aisle.
Okay.
Not with every issue, but this
No,
is the
no.
kind of issue, as Anmol pointed out, it's got bipartisan support. And when we start there, that gives us a running start to be able to say, we're not on and we're not partisan. We're here for the good of our patients, and these bills have bipartisan support because there's a lot of common sense involved in them,
Right.
I think.
Thank you. Thank you for the clarification.
I was just going to quickly add, I think I think we'll have to see the way the Supreme Court rules, but I think depending on how they rule, I think, we can take that argument to certain factions of Congress and use that to our advantage, I think, in this case, to be like, the Supreme Court is already saying that this is something they don't want to go one direction. And the fact that there's bipartisan support in the Senate, I think the challenge is probably the House, I imagine. There seems to still be a sense of collaboration in one chamber and not the other. But my 2 cents.
So if I could ask again, what are next steps?
Janet, you're muted.
Yes, sorry, unmuted. The next step is to build out what we want to see, and decide on a strategy. And when we're on the Hill in June, we will try to see Congress people who are interested in this subject, look for a nexus of concern to sort of expand the group. And these things take time. I mean, we don't anticipate getting anything passed quickly, but the 120th Congress is going to be different in one way or another. And right now, I think what we're seeing is people being open to the possibility that things might actually move a little faster in the next Congress.
So do
Or
we need it? Sorry, do we need a position paper then? Is that what you're saying, or?
no, I think it's a more gathering the information and the facts that back up our stance. What is it doing to patients? What are we seeing? And then endorsing policy. I mean, in any one of those potential laws would be a good vehicle. We'll be reading the room to see what has the most traction. And we're going to bring our special angle to this. Yeah,
Big job.
yeah. Sheila, you have your hand up.
Oh yeah, thanks. I'm actually curious, kind of on that note, also, if and Anmol, I know you've done a lot of like research and thought about this a lot. Are there particular allies that have been working on this or looking at this that would be useful to like partner with and think through some of these questions and these issues and some of the strategies? Are there useful partners? Because I'm also wondering, kind of once that Supreme Court decision comes out, how quickly to like mobilize and build some of those coalitions to actually get back out there, like in June and in other times. Sorry, that was a really long question, but the short version is, are there allies that we should be looking towards?
Sophia, I'll let you answer because I think
Yeah, so I can actually jump in on that quickly. So I know that Doctors for America is part of this larger coalition called RX Allies. And they have monthly meetings. They're super informative. Some of the key organizations, it's um, Public Citizen, who we worked with on the previous letter regarding the Ethic Act, Families USA. I think there's people from Protect Our Care. There's like a number of organizations. And so I have a feeling, depending on how that decision goes, too, we could always partner with those organizations on these issues because they're very active in these areas.
So
Awesome.
those are all good thoughts. And if we could hold the comments now until the end, because we have a bunch of other things to get to on our agenda. There's a lot coming up. So I'm going to turn it back over to Sophia to go over those issues.
Okay. Well, yeah, so I can try and fly through a few things. Let's see. First, just as an update, and Janet, I'll pass it back to you for the PDUFA updates, but as an organization, we've been participating in the Prescription Drug User Fee Act stakeholder meetings that have been going on every month now for the last, I think it's been around 5 or 6 months. It's been
Mhm.
like 5 or 6 meetings, yeah. And so we have been sharing our thoughts with FDA regarding these user fees, while at the same time, FDA and industry are negotiating what that what their commitment letter is going to look like that will then eventually be sent to Congress. And so we wanted to put this on all of your radar because we're going to be putting together a letter at some point once that letter we're going to be sending a letter to Congress once FDA sends their letter to Congress explaining what the user fee package is going to look like. And then we'll speak with Congress and say, these are the things that should be added to this larger piece of legislation. And so don't wanted to put it on your radar because we're going to want everyone's input to help us with that letter that we send to Congress. But Jan, is there anything else on PDUFA and on the stakeholder meetings?
Yeah, but this is, they're negotiating not policy essentially, but what does the pharmaceutical industry want? What can the FDA give them in terms of the review process, essentially? But after that, all of that negotiation is finalized, that's where Congress comes in and has the opportunity to add policy changes, policy riders, or even a major reform bill next year for the FDA. And so, we're positioning ourselves now. We did a congressional briefing the last time we were in Washington, and we're just expanding the number of people that for whom we're a resource so that we can counterbalance to some degree the hundreds of lobbyists that are engaged in trying to get what they want out of this. And we're the credible voice in the room for patients. And so as the summer goes on, we'll be thinking very seriously about this. And in September, we'll start, going into deep dives on PDUFA. So just so it's on your radar, nothing to really be worried about too much now. We'll see when the draft commitment letter comes out sometime this summer. It will be interesting to see how negotiations have truly gone. We only have a hint. So the that paper that Sophia linked in there, the ICER Accelerated Approval Report, is a recommendations for approval or for improvement of the accelerated approval pathway. That's the pathway where drugs are approved on surrogate markers without having to show clinical benefit. And it's a pathway that came in with the very first PDUFA in 1992. So obviously it is got problems and in need of improvement, and we'll be talking about that as time goes on. But I think the next very most important thing before we run out of time is to talk about the advocacy grand rounds next week. So Sophia, if you wouldn't mind
Absolutely.
talking
And
more about that.
throw the link to register in the chat. It's also on the agenda. But on April 30th at 8 p.m., we're going to have our next advocacy grand rounds. And this one is with Marta Wazinska, who is an expert in economics with the Brookings Institute. Marta is fantastic. She's really, really great and extremely knowledgeable on the issue of drug shortages, which is going to be the focus of this AGR. And yeah, I'm really excited. If anybody has any questions, please reach out about it. But yeah, we're really lucky to have Marta speaking with us. And so if you can attend, I highly recommend it. And here is the information and link to register. And then also, just jumping ahead to the next thing too, I also wanted to flag, and I know we've mentioned this at our last couple of meetings, but our National Leadership Conference is coming up in June, and that's June actually 5th through 8th. I think it said 6th on the agenda, but wanted to flag that we will be having the FDA pre-conference on the Friday the of the conference. And the FDA pre-conference that day on Friday is free to attend. We're going to have a ton of speakers, a lot of different sessions. If you can come, it's going to be really, really great. And let me throw those links, and I can also briefly touch on some of the sessions that we're going to have. Jan, our wonderful leader here, will be doing an FDA 101, which will cover the basics for a lot of new folks who want to learn more about the basics of the FDA. And then we will also have a session with a lot of former FDA folks talking about workforce, FDA authority, and kind of just the general changes that are going on right now at FDA. We'll have another session talking about approval pathways, evidence, and kind of talking about speed versus innovation at FDA. We'll have another session on digital health, on AI, and that session I feel like is going to be really great. And also wanted to flag too, because we're starting as an organization to kind of delve into the topic of AI, and so it's going to be really great to have everyone there to kind of learn some of the basics, and that because it's going to be a big issue for us moving forward. We'll also have another session on drug shortages, and then we'll lastly have a session on regulating. So we'll have folks from the Hill, we'll have lawyers kind of talking about FDA decision making, and yeah, that session's going to be great. I know we'll have one of our partner organizations will have some folks from Democracy Forward there. We'll hopefully have some folks from different committees on the Hill. And yeah, so those are some of the sessions for the FDA pre-conference. And if you have any questions about how it works, please let me know. And we'd love to see you there.
Yeah, so we'll be gathering questions that you might have beforehand to make sure that we address those in those meetings. And I just want to point out the SHIC AI Digital Health update that's on the agenda, and that ties in nicely to our AI session for the FDA pre-conference. So we have been working with the Science, Health, and Information Clinic at NYU to come up with essentially a policy brief on AI, digital health, particularly generative AI and mental health. As you know, that is an area where there's a vacuum of regulation, and this is one area where the FDA is proceeding to develop a regulatory framework for the use of generative AI in mental health. And so far, there's have been a couple advisory committee meetings, but we want to get in very early on this, and that's why we're developing this policy statement, and that's going to be refined over time. So this is our first iteration that we've been working with the law students and their advisors on, and we will start the second iteration as soon as this one is done, but this one will be ready before the FDA pre-conference, so you all have a chance to look at it. So some basic education will happen in terms of how the FDA is regulating generative AI and what the ramifications of that are, and what potentially we can do to be part of that process. So it should all be, as Sophia described it, is when I looked at the agenda, I was like, oh, I really have to go to this conference. And I think you'll feel that way too. I think it's going to be an opportunity to learn a lot, and also give us all more tools. As Donald kept pushing us on, how do we do these things? Well, you need tools to do them. And first off is, gathering some experts outside, sometimes outside of medicine, to help us understand all of these issues in a deeper way. And that's why I think the advocacy grand rounds next week with Marta Wozinska will be so helpful. We rarely hear from economists. She's somebody who's been at the FDA, and it's a perspective that really enhances our understanding and has really allowed us to expand our network on the Hill in terms of drug shortages. So it should be really fabulous. So now, since we do have a few minutes, and I know there are questions, please, William, go tell us
Yeah,
what's
not a
on your
question, but a
mind.
point I wanted to just note that JRF or JK, whatever, this came out emphasizing the importance of getting approval of psychedelic products and so forth. It's going to, everything we've talked about is going to be greatly changed in terms of the implications of that because of the way in which these drugs are developed, they're promoted, and also the whole question of how do you tell somebody who's a drug dealer in the basement that a new product can then be patented? I mean, how are you going to do that?
Well, your perspective on this, William, is really valuable because we were just talking today about what our statement is going to be on this. Obviously, from an FDA process viewpoint, creating shortcuts for approval of psychedelic drugs is not in the interests of our patients. And obviously, we're going to come out with a strong statement, but we'd love to have your perspective.
But also the other part of it is that for many of these drugs, they've already gone through phase 4 trials in the real world. And the question is, how do you bring that discussion in terms of FDA approval?
Well, yeah, the FDA does sort of want real world evidence, but how that translates into real world data would be an interesting paradox, I think. But I'd love to actually hear what your thoughts are on the value of psychedelics and the potential risks of a quick approval with shortcuts.
You want me to go into my long dialogue now or the presentation I'm going to give next month? Because
But
it's an interesting issue. Part of it is that it's not a pharmacological issue. What we're talking about is a value type of issue. Why drugs like alcohol are like psilocybin treated differently from aspirin or anything else. Again, it's a value issue related to Western culture and also other cultures have taken these drugs into account. But the Western culture still struggles with this the issue of marijuana, legal laws, and so forth. They're still struggling with that, and I think that's going to be crucial in terms of moving forward. How we're going to tie this into the legal system.
Well, if you have any thoughts that would inform us, particularly as it pertains to personal experiences you've had with complications or even good results of patients who've used psychedelic drugs? I'd love to hear about it.
Full disclosure, I was helping with developing ketamine in terms of bringing it to market, but at the same time, I was part of the demonstrations along with our RJK of trying to limit the use of marijuana in the district. So I got my feet
Yeah.
planted on both sides of the fence.
Hmm. And Jeffrey.
Well, since we have the time, I'd like to go back on the previous discussion about patents from the clinic to the macro political perspective. You know, speaking as a clinician, uh, being able to treat people with familial hypertriglyceridemia with TGs over 1,000, you know, that's a great drug. But if you have someone with cholesterol and high triglycerides, I'm not sure it's proven that you get much marginal benefit by using this expensive drug in addition to a cholesterol lowering agent or agents. And therefore, this is a tempest in a teapot with minor clinical significance. And that leads me to the macro thing, which is I think our position ought to use the Supreme Court to expand a loud voice in opposing the abuse of patents as the larger issue, which really does affect a lot of clinical care. And in response to what William said, the problem with psychedelics in my secondary experience, secondhand experience, is that the appropriate use of them involves careful clinical attention to the process. And that kind of mimics what the FDA tried to do with, I don't know, naloxone and other medicines like that. So it's not only a drug approval, it's requirement for a certain level of clinical care during the use of those drugs. So it's more complex than a chemical agent pharmaceutical.
Well, I agree with you on both counts. I don't think there has been good clinical data that for normal high triglycerides that it makes any difference whatsoever to lower them with fish oil. I think it's failed in trial after trial. And I also agree with you that, you know, that it's interesting when you look at the restrictions they put on Suboxone, and yet here we are contemplating on the basis of Joe Rogan and conversation he had with RFK and a tweet that here we are. But here we are. And wish Sophia luck because she will be there at the health committee meetings with RFK tomorrow. So we hope that she gets in and gives us a firsthand account of the zeitgeist in the room.
Gonna be an adventure.
Hey, run away.
Well, she's very brave, fortunately. So, Anmol, again, thank you so much for presenting this. It was just an absolutely fabulous advancement for us. It takes us in a direction which I think will, you know, be very fruitful and satisfying to us because it's one of those areas where I think Doctors for America is going to have that voice that's a little louder than some of the others in the room. And, you know, what a great pickup. So regardless of what the Supreme Court does, this is something that we should consider continuing and continuing to make it a focus of our advocacy. Well, thank you to everybody for sharing your evening with us. And I hope that Anmol has planted some, you know, new thoughts and new passions that we can build on in the future. And that's, you know, what we do. We just keep making a stronger network, you know, nurture those connections, and it will have results. So thank you to everybody.